So many examples can be quoted of the relationship between the state of a people and the country or the land in which they live. One example which President Ikeda gave in his book In the Human Revolution was how thunder occurred in Manchuria at a time of year when never it had been known in all history. At the time the Japanese forces invaded that particular country and brought devastation and ruin to it. There were terrible winters in World War I. We've all probably seen movies or pictures of the fearful conditions of such battles as the one on the Somme. Then, strangely, after World War II, there was a period in this country anyway, I don't know about others, of about 10 years of greyness. This greyness was pretty general throughout Europe, anyway the northern part of Europe. Summers were almost non-existent. Many of you will remember. There was no such thing as a warm summer. And every day seemed to be cold and grey and rainy. This was the period of the Cold War, when it was at its worst. Likewise, there is a connection, maybe, between the uncanny, dry, almost desert-like weather that we experienced in this country in more recent years, 4, 5, 6 years ago, with the crisis that was going on in the world at that time from the point of view of exhaustion of raw materials, and particularly the oil crisis. So people rarely notice these things. Yet if we go to Taiseki, the head temple of Nichiren Shoshu, there, almost every time we visit, we can see some wonder of the behavior of the environment in relation to that center of the ultimate truth, where Nam-myoho Renge-kyo is chanted day in, day out, almost without ceasing. So I've told you before in these lectures of the amazing happenings of the weather and the clouds at the time of the opening of Shohondo, when the Daigo Honzen was carried to its final sanctuary. We are blind. This is the truth of it, isn't it, in this technological age. Our forebears of many, 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 many hundreds of years ago understood something of this. Red Indians understood something of this. The people who are living in simple villages in the midst of Africa understand something of this. But we, in these so-called civilized countries, have forgotten it and become blind to it. We think and rely on our minds. Yet the truth is that if we only rely on our minds, on the mechanism of our thinking, we block wisdom from flowing through our lives. And the teaching of Nichiren Daishonin, of course, is based on opening up our lives, ceasing to worry and think and rely on the lesser ego and bring out wisdom from the depths. So Honen's reputation at this time was almost like Jesus Christ. He was almost a mythical, wondrous figure in Japan in those medieval times. He was already dead, and many were the legends about him. And it was these Nembutsu followers, believing in this man, who in fact, enraged by Nichiren Daishonin's RISSHO ANKOKU RON, which we're studying now, attacked his small cottage in Matsubagayatsu near Kamakura and tried to kill him. And many of the other persecutions that followed were instigated by them. So of course we've seen the same thing in history, in other people who were trying to do good. Christ was persecuted, was he not, by the Jews. And those who criticized Christianity in the Middle Ages and after were also blindly persecuted. Such horrendous inventions as the Inquisition or burning people at the stake was all in the cause of obliterating those who dared to question something to do with the established religion of the day. Mr. Makiguchi, the first president of the Soka Gakkai, and Mr. Toda, the second president, also criticized the established religion and refused to submit to its teachings, that religion being Shinto, the state religion of Japan. As a result, they were persecuted and jailed. So no wonder, in the history and life of the Soka Gakkai and the spread of the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin, there has always been persecution as well as shakabuku, as well as teaching others. The inferior teachings had to be refuted in order to establish the ultimate truth. So these great men, Mr. Makiguchi, Mr. Toda, going back even down the line of high priests to Nikko Shonin, who inherited the teachings from Nichiren Daishonin, these great men, through what they withstood, have sheltered us and enabled us to receive the Gohonzon in this day and age in far more peaceful circumstances than ever existed before. So I'm going to stop there for 5 or 7 minutes or so. Please have a break, and then we'll carry on. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Robert. If I may, I want to take you back now to those smelly privies and the insects that live on bitter smartweed. So it's probably the truth today, I believe, that wherever you look, whether in fields of society, whether in politics or economics or science or even in education, it all smells to one degree or another. And this is because, I think, man has had no rock or philosophy on which to really base his actions. And we all and our fellow neighbors and countrymen have grown apathetic about this situation. We've been living in it for such a long time now. We feel often nothing can be done about it. We get used to accepting it. And we just perhaps sometimes can't be bothered. This is the truth about society's reactions to the wrongs that we can see all around us. In the 3rd chapter of the Lotus Sutra, no less than 3,000 or so years ago, Shakyamuni said this: "They dwell in hell so long that they come to think it is natural as playing in a garden, and the other evil paths seem like their own home." This is a human tendency. So an amazing situation arises where those who try to change what smells are attacked generally by society because they disturb the status quo. And those who go with it are rewarded. So, for example, if you take a young teacher, he may passionately rebel against what he sees are the smells or the cause of the smells in the education system. And he tries to change it, or she tries to change it. And she fails, or he fails. Maybe they try again, and they fail. Maybe they try again, and they fail. And in the end, because they want the security of their job, or because they passionately believe in their role as teachers, no matter what, they have to give in. And of course, in the end, by the time middle age arrives probably, they're living amidst the smell without even smelling it. I'm really looking forward to when our education group, our group of teachers and educators, which is still so small, but in perhaps 10, 15, 20 years' time, really begin, based on the sound philosophy of Nichiren Daishonin, to really move some form of change in the educational system as we see it today. Of course, it's a human tendency to accept what we find around us, the established ways. However, thank goodness, there's always youth, young people. Always it's youth who try their best to seek something new or to change things that they believe to be wrong. Of course, they're not always right, but they have the driving force. Therefore, if properly directed by a sound and all-embracing philosophy and practice, they can follow the true way. So the driving force of any revolution, including religious revolutions, is usually young people. I want to look now at another passage on page 21, left-hand column.
A man such as Honen is in truth the deadly enemy of the Buddhas and the scriptures, and the foe of sage monks and ordinary men and women alike.
I hope you've all found that in the middle of the left-hand column. Can you read it again, Robert?
A man such as Honen is in truth the deadly enemy of the Buddhas and the scriptures, and the foe of sage monks and ordinary men and women alike.
In the end, all social problems, Nichiren Daishonin is saying, can be traced back to a religious source, to inferior or wrong philosophical or religious teachings. For example, maybe I mentioned it once before, the class struggle in this country and the evils of the class system have grown out of an authoritarian church. Their superior attitude going back to its earliest days towards those who were ordinary people. If you go to Fountain Abbey in Yorkshire, you can see the glory of the accommodation for the monks and the priests as against the lower orders or the ordinary people like us who lived in darkness below. God is superior to everyone, and therefore the priest who serves God is superior. And this was the attitude that led to the class struggles that we are involved in today. Even in my young days, the best pews in church were reserved for those who could afford them. In other words, you had to pay quite a high rental to have the front row every service. Further back, before the Industrial Revolution, when that system came in, the front rows were always left for the nobility and the local squires. Where, for example, was Christ's compassion in the social ostracism of congenital idiots, people who were insane, or the very poor indeed, such as occurred in the 18th century? People segregated because of their awful circumstances in fearful institutions with no hope from life whatsoever. You only have to read Dickens to learn all about it. Thus, Nichiren Daishonin said, people teaching inferior teachings were the most evil people in the world, whether they were consciously so or not. Religion should never be approached blindly. It should be discussed freely and openly, as I said earlier. But still, in the hearts of the people, there is the feeling, what right have we to do it? Or we don't understand it, or worrying about the wrath of God descending on them. Even, of course, in the last 100 years, in men's clubs and such places, the subject of religion and women was always banned. Sometimes even there were notices up saying there will be no discussion of religion or women on these premises. So religion, of course, has always raised superstitious emotion and fears. Women, of course, raise a different sort of emotion. But if religion really explains the truth of life, it must be logical, mustn't it, and stand up to argument and open discussion. But of course, it's all these reasons that make people sometimes upset or shaken if we begin to talk about religion to them. The freedom of religion, surely, is not just freedom of worship, but it's also freedom of discussion. And this is what ought to be actively encouraged by our activities. And it's for this reason, or one of the reasons why Sensei, when he was on European summer course, said we should talk about religion, whether or not people are interested in listening to what we say. That doesn't mean to say we go on and on talking if they've got up and walked away. But what it means is, don't worry about whether you feel they're going to react well or not. Just try. And by trying, you sow the seed. And open up an area of interest which perhaps may not finally blossom until much later. Because of Nichiren Shoshu's truly magnificent confidence in the power of the Gohonzon and in its ability to satisfy the three proofs, especially actual proof, they provide us with a framework for debate which has been used in all the debates that have occurred down through history. This framework is in the form of, first of all, something called the five-fold comparisons, and secondly, in the 5 guides for propagation. But the conviction in the power of the Gohonzon, which we all have, because we get actual proof, enables us to approach in this way. Of course, in a non-Buddhist country, we don't have to use this to the same extent as they do in Buddhist countries. But just very briefly, the five-fold comparison consists first of all in comparing Buddhism with non-Buddhism. And secondly, Mahayana Buddhism as against Hinayana Buddhism. And thirdly, the true teaching, which is the Lotus Sutra, Shakyamuni's supreme teaching, against the provisional teachings. And fourthly, the essential teaching in the Lotus Sutra, which is the Juryo chapter, as against the theoretical chapters. And finally, the Buddhism of the sowing, which is Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, as against the Buddhism of Shakyamuni, which is known as the Buddhism of the harvest. If you wish to study these, and it's certainly useful to do so in order to get one's own mind in order, you can read them in the third of the special study supplements that were issued, rather like blue printed copies of the UK Express, which were printed 2 or 3 years ago, and which I think we still have copies available. So in each progressive debate throughout history, this framework of approach has been used and has been irrefutable. The 5 guides for propagation are, firstly, that the teaching should be correct for the age. That, of course, comes out of that 5-fold comparison that I've just mentioned. Secondly, that the people have the intellectual capacity to accept it. Thirdly, that the time is right. Certainly, the time when Japan was devastated was right. Certainly, the time when people will be most receptive to it is now, in the West, when there is so much havoc and misery in all directions. Fourthly, that the country or society should be considered in those teachings. In other words, that the teachings can be propagated in accordance with the culture of each country. And finally, that previous teaching should be understood so that it can be refuted in debate. So the confidence we have in the Gohonzon, and which all the high priests have had down through the ages, has led to such a clear approach to what we call Shakabuku. Now, let's look at another sentence, which is on page 22, bottom of the first paragraph, or nearly the end of the first paragraph.
Thus, China provided an earlier example of how Pure Land teachings brought about the fall of an emperor, and our own country offers similar proof.
So here Nichiren Daishonin moves on from theoretical proof, and very briefly gives actual proof based on actual happenings in the history of China and Japan. We won't go through them in detail, but if you want to refer to it, they're in the preceding paragraph. So by now, he has his guest the traveler, thinking deeply. Some of the rage has subsided, and sufficiently so for the traveler to ask another question. Question 6, which Robert will read now.
The guest looking somewhat mollified, said, "Though I have not yet probed deeply into the matter, I believe I understand to some degree what you are saying. Nevertheless, both in Kyoto, the capital, and in Kamakura, the headquarters of the shogun, there are numerous eminent Buddhist leaders and key figures in the clergy. And yet none of them have so far appealed to the shogun concerning this affair, or submitted a memorial to the throne. You, on the other hand, a person of humble position, think nothing of spewing out offensive accusations. Your assertions are open to question, and your reasoning lacks authority." The host said, "Though I may be a person of little ability, I have reverently given myself to the study of the Mahayana. A blue fly, if it clings to the tail of a thoroughbred horse, can travel 10,000 miles. And the green ivy that twines around the tall pine can grow to 1,000 feet. I was born as the son of the one Buddha, Shakyamuni, and I serve the king of the scriptures, the Lotus Sutra. How could I observe the decline of the Buddhist law and not be filled with the emotions of pity and distress? Moreover, the Nirvana Sutra states, if even a good priest sees someone slandering the law and disregards him, failing to reproach him, to oust him, or to punish him for his offense, then you should know that the priest is an enemy of the Buddhist law. But if he is willing to reproach the person, to oust him or punish him for his offense, then he is my disciple, and one who truly understands my teachings. Although I may not be a good priest, I certainly do not want to be accused of being an enemy of the Buddhist law. Therefore, in order to avoid such charges, I have cited a few general principles and given a rough explanation of the matter. In the past, at the time of the Genin era, 1224, as a result of petitions to the throne submitted time and again by the two temples of Enryakuji on Mount Hiei and Kofukuji in Nara, an imperial command and a letter of instruction were handed down, ordering that the wood blocks used in printing Honen's Senshaku Shu be confiscated and brought to the great lecture hall of Enryakuji Temple. There they were burned in order to repay the debt owed to the Buddhas of the past, present, and future. In addition, orders were given that the menials who were attached to the Gion shrine should dig up and destroy Honen's grave in Kyoto. At this time, Honen's disciples, Ryakin, Shoko, Jokaku, Sasho, and others were condemned to exile in distant regions, and for some time after they continued to remain out of favor with the government. In view of these facts, how can you say that no one has submitted a complaint to the authorities concerning these matters?
So as you can see, despite all Nichiren Daishonin's arguments, the traveler is still at least sentimentally attached to the established order of things, in other words, the teaching of Nembutsu as founded by Honen. And of course it is difficult for human beings to give up previous beliefs or established views. Some of us perhaps find it difficult to cut attachment to Christianity, not because we believe in Christianity once we've embraced the Gohonzon, yet there are still sentimental ties. Perhaps people find they miss the services, the beauty of them, and the hymns, though that doesn't apply to me. Or perhaps the great buildings, the cathedrals and the churches. Perhaps it's because ever since they were little toddlers, they have said the Lord's Prayer at their mother's side. All sorts of sentimental reasons can make one cling to what is in fact not the ultimate truth, even though the ultimate truth is explained and known to you. Nichiren Daishonin also, to convince the traveler, explained that Honen had in fact already been rejected by the authorities of Japan in 1224. That was only 30 years before this thesis was written. Yet, in that 30 years, a 180-degree turn had been done, and people had embraced the Nembutsu, despite the explanations of its erroneous teachings 30 years before. Yet, in fact, Honen's disgrace was very complete. He was exiled. He was even given his name after death before he died, which was the ultimate disgrace. And after his death, his gravestone was destroyed, his body was dug up, and it was thrown into the sea. This was immediately after Honen died, only just 25 or 30 years before Nembutsu spread in those terrible times when Nichiren Daishonin was living. So the human being can be very fickle. I want to study now one paragraph right at the beginning of the answer, which is at the bottom of page 22, left-hand column. Page 22, left-hand column at the bottom.
The host said, "Though I may be a person of little ability, I have reverently given myself to the study of the Mahayana. A blue fly, if it clings to the tail of a thoroughbred horse, can travel 10,000 miles. And the green ivy that twines around a tall pine can grow to 1,000 feet.
It's very beautiful writing, isn't it? But Nichiren Daishonin compares himself there to the worst and most despised of all insects, that horrible blue fly that buzzes round the dustbin. But he points out that if it clings onto the tail of a thoroughbred, it can travel enormous distances. So, in saying that, Nichiren Daishonin, of course, is pointing out that you do not have to be of high social status in order to discover and teach the truth of life. So Nichiren Daishonin, as it were, stuck to the tail of the thoroughbred horse, which was the Lotus Sutra. This was his self-enlightenment. That Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, which he understood with his life, was in fact in the orthodox flow of Buddhism and was contained in the depths of the Lotus Sutra. And he then studied for so many years in order to prove this. To understand the documentary proof for his self-enlightenment as quite a young man, the law of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. So because this law was in his heart, of course it dictated all his values and all his actions based on those values. And we see that in the whole history of his life and all that he achieved in it. Likewise, because we find the true law, or the Gohonzon, and are awakened to it, that law dictates our actions based on our values on that law. For this reason, no doubt, so many of you have kindly come this afternoon to study together and listen to this lecture in Porchester Hall. But if people hold the wrong law or philosophy in their hearts, then inevitably their values are equally wrong and distorted, and therefore their actions too are distorted. In other words, their actions will not be for their happiness if they're against the true law of life, but rather for their unhappiness. So the value of a person's actions depends entirely, doesn't it, on the law in their hearts. This applies to society as a whole too. So to find the right law and base one's life on it is of absolute, total, and ultimate importance. Yet, sadly, that is so little understood in this world today. In the Gosho, Nichiren Daishonin wrote, "Since the law is supreme, the person is respect-worthy. And since the person is respect-worthy, the land is sacred." Therefore, in the Lotus Sutra, it says that to attain this law of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo is a greater benefit than all the jewels of the universe. Because from then on, one's thoughts and therefore one's actions are based on the ultimate truth of life. So for this reason, if not for many other, how much we need to shakabuku. Looking around us and seeing how few understand the ultimate truth, and how as a result of that their values are wrong or distorted and their actions follow suit. Through sowing the seed of the true law, of the true understanding of life in the hearts of people, of course they then find that their actions are leading them to happiness. This is perhaps the greatest and most important and profound reason for shakabuku. Now let's look at another paragraph in the right-hand column.
I was born as the son of the one Buddha, Shakyamuni, and I served the king of scriptures, the Lotus Sutra. How could I observe the decline of the Buddhist law and not be filled with emotions of pity and distress?
Thank you. So this may be perhaps a little confusing, but Nichiren Daishonin had to be terribly careful what he said about himself, otherwise his followers would have suffered even worse persecutions, and possibly himself also. Therefore it wasn't until much later, after his exile to Sado Island, that he actually declared himself as the Buddha of this age of Mappo. In this case, he calls himself the son of the one Buddha, Shakyamuni. So if we have gratitude, which is what Nichiren Daishonin is referring to here, for all the benefits that we've gained since we started to practice, how can we honestly prevent ourselves from spreading those benefits to others and teaching others how to gain them themselves? Other people's sufferings surely must move us to do that. Sensei said, shakabuku is proof of whether we are true disciples of Nichiren Daishonin and whether we really understand that we're bodhisattvas of the earth. This is the spirit, isn't it, of Fuji Shakushimyo. I've mentioned it before, but that phrase contained in the Jigage chapter of Gongyo. Fuji Shakushimyo, preceded by Ishin Yoken Butsu, Fuji Shakushimyo. We say it no less than 8 times a day in morning and evening prayer. And it means urgently desiring to see the Buddha. We do not begrudge our lives. Urgently desiring to see the Buddha state rising in our life, we give our whole life in return, devoting ourselves to Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. I remember saying to the youth division 2 years ago, whenever you say that phrase, Ishin Yoken Butsu Fuji Shakushimyo, it's a good point to check whether, in that particular Gongyo, one is feeling that one's giving oneself wholeheartedly. Because that is the spirit which will bring the greatest joy in life. As long as we begrudge our lives, we begrudge our time maybe, going to this lecture, or the cost of the fare, or our energy in doing activities for shakabuku, then of course we can't feel joyful. It isn't until we can let go of the twig of the tree and take a great jump that we can really gain unbelievable joy out of this practice. So of course benefits bring joy, but the greatest joy comes from giving one's time and energy wholeheartedly and without resentment in return. This is the proof of the pudding. Now this is the spirit of Fuji Shakushimyo. So, of course, all the great people in the history of Nichiren Shoshu, Nikko Shonin, who succeeded Nichiren Daishonin as high priest, the 3 martyrs of Atsuhara, Mr. Makiguchi, first president of the Lay Society, Mr. Todu, the second president, Sensei, today, all have this spirit of giving their life wholeheartedly. Okay, now we look at another paragraph, just below.
If even a good priest sees someone slandering the law and disregards him, failing to reproach him, to oust him, or to punish him for his offence, then you should know that the priest is an enemy of the Buddhist law. But if he is willing to reproach the person, to oust him, or punish him for his offence, then he is my disciple, and one who truly understands my teachings.
Very important point. This paragraph, which sounds so strict, yet is in the spirit of pure Buddhist mercy, or jihi, pure compassion. If someone slanders someone else who is actually embracing the true law, or the Gonzen, the Lotus Sutra actually says that sickness will occur in that slanderer in this life, and heavy sickness in the next. This is in the light of cause and effect, of slandering the true law. Of course, this doesn't mean that everyone who's sick has slandered the law. But this is the effect of such a cause. There can be other causes of sickness. But therefore, unless we stop people who are slandering the law, we have no mercy or compassion. Otherwise, the distorted teachings will grow because of those persons' actions, and they themselves will suffer more. So this, of course, is especially important within the organization. We have to take action if, for some reason, onshitsu or slander gets a grip on someone concerning another member. But it also applies outside to anybody who is slandering life, the true law. Therefore, people who don't spread the teachings once they have received them themselves are allowing, aren't they, more space for the inferior teachings and misunderstandings of life to grow, allowing the world to head for disaster that little bit more quickly, rather than arresting that downhill rush. So really, in every respect, we have to chant to do shakabuku. Shakabuku is a matter, isn't it, as Nichiren Daishonin shows in this thesis, of straight, sincere speaking. It's cowardly if we see someone suffering because of slander not to do anything about it. Straight speaking, as Sensei once said, is true democracy. Now, Sensei said Mr. Makaguchi's favorite gosho passage was in the opening of the eyes, and I'm going to ask Robert to read it now.
If someone is about to kill your father and mother, shouldn't you try to warn them? If an evil son who is insane with drink is threatening to kill his father and mother, shouldn't you try to stop him? If some evil person is about to set fire to the temples and pagodas, shouldn't you try to stop him? If your only child is gravely ill, shouldn't you try to cure him with moxibustion treatment? To fail to do so is to act like those people who do not try to put a stop to the Zen and Nembutsu followers in Japan. As Chang'an says, if one befriends another person but lacks the mercy to correct him, he is in fact his enemy. I, Nichiren, am sovereign, teacher, father and mother to all the people of Japan. But the men of the Tendai sect, who do not refute the heretical sects, are all great enemies of the people. As Chang'an has noted, he who makes it possible for an offender to rid himself of evil is acting like a parent to him.
Thank you. So that passage is really, I believe, important for all of us. If you want to refer back to it, it's in volume 2 of the Gosho, page 212, from the opening of the eyes. But this is the Gosho passage that led to Mr. Makaguchi's great spirit, and Mr. Toda's great spirit, Sensei's great spirit. And of course, it is in itself the spirit of Nichiren Daishonin. He braved anything in order to save people from suffering. And his courage was truly incredible. Really, he was a lion, wasn't he, amongst men? So, in every sense, when we read such a passage and we see how Nichiren Daishonin lived it in every respect, our gratitude should be enormous. our gratitude for receiving the Gohonzon and all those who brought it to us. And in the case of those earlier days, braved incredible persecution. After all, not so long ago, only perhaps 35 years since Mr. Makaguchi died in prison and Mr. Toda just about got out alive. So this should make us feel gratitude, shouldn't it, in that third prayer of Gongyo. Double the gratitude, perhaps, that we've been feeling up to now. And this should really double our determination to try to live those words of Nichiren Daishonin and carry on the heritage. So, of course, in return, we're bound to get some sanshoshima. That is to say, the negative force of life is bound to try to interfere. When we think about doing shakabuku, something shuts our mind to it. Always we have that. But that, Nichiren Daishonin said, is the truth that this is the true law. The fact that it immediately incites opposition from the negative force of life in the most subtle ways. So there's one gosho that I'd like to mention on that point, number 3. This is page 40 and 41 of volume 1.
In the past, he despised the votaries of the Lotus Sutra and ridiculed the sutra itself, sometimes with exaggerated praise and other times with contempt. He has met all 8 of these terrible sufferings for such acts against the Lotus Sutra, which is as magnificent as 2 jewels combined, 2 moons shining side by side, 2 stars conjoined, or 1 Mount Hua placed atop another. Usually these sufferings would torment a person over many lifetimes, appearing one at a time. But Nichiren has denounced the enemies of the Lotus Sutra so severely that all 8 descended upon him at once. His situation is like that of a peasant, heavily in debt to his lord and others. As long as he remains on the estate, they are likely to defer his debts from 1 year to the next, rather than mercilessly hounding him. But as soon as he tries to leave, everyone will rush over and demand that he repay everything at once. Thus the sutra states, it is due to the blessings obtained by protecting the law that one can diminish his suffering and retribution.
Thank you. So this is Nichiren Daishonin talking about himself and how, because he so strongly castigated the false teachings, all the retribution possible came on him in the form of the negative or devilish force of life, which is always working against the positive and valuable side of it. But also, of course, in the last part of that passage, talking about the chap who, when he's living and has been living in the same village for years, gets credit from the bank manager and the tradespeople and all the rest of it, and everything is quite peaceful. But the moment he stands up and says he's going to move, all the creditors are there at his door and the bank manager's on the phone every day asking for his loan back. This is the truth of life. So the same with us. We are like that chap. When we start to practice and move our lives more positively forward than ever before, inevitably that negative force comes up and tries to stop us. So this is the natural force of life, which we call sanshoshima. But always that sanshoshima can be overcome. Only fools run away or panic. Those who are wise rejoice, because it means that truly they're following the teachings of the Buddha. So Mr. Toda and Mr. Makaguchi, Nichiren Daishonin himself, have taken the brunt of everything. We today spread the teachings, as it were, under their umbrella. But of course in our own individual lives we do find this opposition still working against us. And if it didn't, Nichiren Daishonin saying, this would not be the true law that we're spreading. This makes sense, doesn't it? Likewise, of course, we ourselves are unhappy or happy because of our karma. Through Shakabuku, Nichiren Daishonin taught many, many occasions we can change our unhappy karma and enter a higher state of life. No wonder the devilish force of life resists as it does and tries to stop us from advancing. This is proof of the power of shakabuku to change karma in itself. At summer course this year, Sensei said, shakabuku is not something invented by Nichiren Shoshu or the Soka Gakkai. It is the will and testament of Nichiren Daishonin. Because out of shakabuku, we can become happy and change those aspects of our karma which have caused us